To the Frick Pittsburgh's Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow. I am Amanda Gillen, and I'm thrilled that Alonna Carter and Lauryn Smith, who were with us for episode 1, have joined us again for another conversation about a really jam-packed episode 2 of The Gilded Age that aired on Sunday night. The title of this episode was Some Sort of Trick, and that refers to, different things we can talk about, but we have a lot to cover. So welcome back, Lauryn and Alonna, and I think I'll just turn it over to you both to take it from here. I think, Alonna, we talked about starting with some thoughts you had about the overall theme, or kind of what you saw as one central theme to this entire very busy episode.
Yeah, I felt that this entire episode was all about social mores during this time. There were so many interactions between the characters that really defined what was acceptable during that time and what was not acceptable. One of the people who I really thought about was obviously Bertha. And I loved how the episode opens up with Bertha yelling at the top of her lungs to her husband about Gladys not wanting to go to Newport. And this was so uncharacteristic of what we know about Victorian women at this time. They were supposed to be soft-spoken. You might be able to cut with, some quick wit or, a little bit of a sharp tongue, but you were never supposed to raise your voice. So that was one of the things that I thought about. But I want to kind of jump in and ask Lauryn, did you notice anything that stuck out to you?
Yeah, definitely when you brought that up and then seeing the difference between the relationship with her yelling at her daughter and then also chastising her son and how maybe effective those might have been. I think just in general, really fascinating to see the different relationships and across social strata, just what was considered acceptable versus not acceptable, like you were speaking of, and the fact that Bertha's coming from what we know a lower income, likely from poverty, as one of these new upstarts. And that maybe she doesn't have that social training of what is expected of a woman of her standing, of, say, Agnes, who was born into wealth, as we talked about last episode, really coming in from like old money Dutch New York.
Right. There was in season 1, they referenced Bertha Russell's background, right? That she, her mother had died in poverty. She seems to have come from not even just a middle-class background, but like a struggling background. And there was an insult. Somebody was calling her a potato farmer's daughter or something. So we don't know, right, her full backstory, but they're alluding to bits and pieces of her really having worked her way up. And we don't know where she meets Mr. Russell. I don't know if they'll reveal any of that, but she clearly has made it to the pinnacle of wealth and society, although she's still trying, right? She's going to keep going.
As we have her ascension, one of the other things we saw coming out of this episode was around Mr. Watson and his apparent very, very heavy fall from grace that he's serving one of his children who is in this wealthy upper echelon and is a part of, I think it was the McNeils, Mrs. McNeil, who's going to be involved, it seems, in this forthcoming opera battle for either the Met or the Academy. Who will reign supreme? Probably the Metropolitan, because it still exists today. That'd be my guess. But be very curious to hear his backstory and how he's now come from that really elite circle to now be a manservant. And kind of the discussion of around there. Again, like we keep talking about respectability last episode too, of this fall for grace, and what will people think not only of the McNeils, but also of the Russells.
Other thoughts, Alonna? Social mores. We talked in our prep call about a lot about the women in this episode. Again, right back to our women, but it seemed like every woman had a storyline happening that was very active, and some women were taking charge of their situations. Other women were being put in situations that were kind of forced upon them. Like I'm thinking about Marion in this episode, who is something of a pawn, right? And for Agnes and for other people who are trying to get her settled and fix her up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like what was going on with her storyline?
Yeah. So, of course, we saw in this episode that Agnes was really keen on setting Marion up with this Morgan fellow. Um, and he obviously was somebody who had a lot to be desired. We saw that he, was a heavy drinker, and also that he just apparently didn't know how to comport himself very well in social situations. But with this, going back to the whole social moire idea that we've been talking about, Agnes saw him as a potential suitor based off of the fact that she knew his mother. And it was really about, I think, honestly, it was about the name and the connection. That's what determines whether or not you are worthy enough to marry, someone in this particular society. The other thing I wanted to jump off of with the social mores was just obviously this relationship with Mrs. Blaine and Larry, which was completely against social, just everything during this time. It was so acceptable during that time for an older man to marry a younger woman, or to be involved with a younger woman, but it was not acceptable for an older woman to be involved with a younger man. And you see this very charged scene where Bertha and Larry are in a heated argument about his liaison with Mrs. Blaine, and how she even says, she's old enough to be your mother. And that was the idea about women during this time, that especially once they reached a certain age, and if they were widowed, they were supposed to take on like this maternal, like motherly figure. They're not supposed to be seen as, objects of attraction or people that you get involved with. And if they are seen as an object of attraction, of course, they're going to be an object of attraction for an older, widower as opposed to a young man. So I'll say that, and then I'll just open it up. Lauryn, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about Miss Blaine last week too, and that she was already kind of throwing out these red flags, and that she wasn't doing what she was supposed to as a widow. It had only been 18 months since her husband died, and she was already like, let's rip up the whole house and redo it, and I'm going to spend all this money, which obviously caused Ward and Bertha to gossip a bit about it. And then so now to see just so quickly, I was just shocked with how quickly they went there. There was just from the very beginning of their interactions, it was like chemistry, it's on, let's have some champagne at lunch and come to the tennis match. And I'll be really curious to see how that goes now that it looks like we're entering, I don't even know what shape this would be, this very complicated, beyond a love triangle with maybe Larry, maybe Marion, maybe Miss Blaine, maybe the cousin who's not really a cousin.
Dashel, right?
Dashel, thank you.
Dashing Dashel, as we have named him.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it kind of presents this really interesting social commentary that also adds to the drama, right? Of will they choose the respectable partner that Bertha and Agnes want for their respective wards, or are they going to potentially follow love? Is that real love? And that's something we see come up too in the opening scenes between Gladys and her father, where he makes her promise that he will support her if she has a marriage of love and not convenience, which I found quite touching. And I had brought that up in prep too, that we had these two really touching scenes between daughters and fathers, with Gladys and Mr. Russell, and then with Peggy and her father, Arthur, at his pharmacology drugstore in Brooklyn, where he is trying to give her money, which is like such a parent thing. I think even today, no matter how old you are, my mom still tries to give me a little gas money here and there, even as an adult. So just very touching and kind of pushing back on this idea of that everything was a marriage of convenience, and, that there was a potential for love matches too.
We can move on to Peggy, but just to comment quickly, a couple things just on what you were saying. I loved the moment when Agnes finds out that there is a Morgan boy who's a potential suitor to meet Marion. It was the most sort of most spark, most excitement we've seen on Agnes have. She sat straight up. I know his mother. I mean, that was clearly like, this resonated. This was a moment she could grab onto and got very excited. And Marion is a very good sport. I mean, she really probably just wants to go to Newport and have some fun, but she's, and then thinking about Bertha and Alonna and Lauryn, you were talking about her yelling at the beginning and then yelling at her son. I thought that conversation with her son, I mean, I was like upright, mouth open, sort of shocked. I mean, he's 23, 22. He's not 17, but it was a very bold conversation when she sort of like smells perfume on him and is like, where have you been? And then they just immediately go there and have this argument about him being with Mrs. Blaine. And it was also out in the open that he had spent the night with her that I was astonished. I will just say that. Sitting there with my cocktail on Sunday night, I was just like, wow, that was really quite the conversation. How do you come back from that mother-son moment? And then his father is very much like Mr. Russell's like, boys will be boys, which we were all saying we hate that phrase. And everything that entails, but he seemed very unbothered that his son was, taking up with this married woman. And then there's Gladys, who they're watching over so carefully, who does get herself out of the Oscar Van Ryn situation, and is moving on to, finding other people. And as you pointed out, Lauryn, she looked lovely and like confection in her dress, her flowered dress. The clothes in this episode were some of the prettiest I think we've seen. Who was mentioning colors? One of you was talking about colors in last episode, in this one.
Yeah. It's so in comparison to the first episode and this episode. So in the first episode, I noticed a whole lot that there was a lot of gold and black, yellow and black. And of course, I'm thinking, okay, they are giving us a little shout out in Pittsburgh, right? Because they've mentioned Pittsburgh a couple of times. But in this episode, we see a lot of blues, whites, reds. And yes, there is that, the wine pattern, which I think it was Gladys who had the pink in her dress, but a lot of summery colors, because I guess that's exactly, what the time it was. We saw them out there watching the tennis match in Newport. And yes, I think the colors kind of fit the season, but I just love how they did so many variations of the blue and the white. You had Bertha's dress, which was very, when we think of the word Americana, like I saw that, and her dress like reminded me of like a very high style Betsy Ross kind of dress. And I don't know why, but it just reminded me of something like if somebody was to do an updated fashion, portfolio of like the dresses from the American Revolution or something. That's what her dress looked like. I don't know if anybody else saw that.
I love that. I thought it was a little frumpy almost, right? It had the sash and the ruffle, and they made a big deal about her wanting this dress, and then it wasn't one of her best looks. You're right. It had a little bit of an old fashioned touch to it. Marion, when she goes, this is irrelevant to anything other than style, but when she is going to work and she's got that dark blue, almost like a suit type dress, sort of, it's just very tailored, and the hat with the red flowers, red and blue again. She just looks, I think so that's a more professional look. They often have her in sort of not girlish, but like lighter confections and dresses that are a little bit more fluffy. And she was clearly going to work in that, in that outfit. I love how the clothes tell all these different stories, and the hats were spectacular. I mean, we talked about hats last time, but they were enormous, floral, just, like bouquets on people's heads this time. I thought it was really, really a lot of fun. Talking about Newport, so talking about Marion a little bit. We can just mention this. I think, Lauryn, you mentioned her and Larry. We don't know where that's going to go. It seems like all through season 1 and now into season 2, they're teasing this, like, do they like each other? Do they not? They're very happy to see each other all the time, which is kind of nice, but whether that's a good friendship and neighbors or whether that's more than that, I guess we'll have to see. So there's that. And then we know that Mrs. Blaine was not at all happy to see Marion.
I think that was one of my favorite lines was, oh, the next door neighbor. Just Laura Benatti is incredible. It delivers it with so much like, oh, you're a nuisance. Please leave. Yeah. I know it is very interesting to see what's going to happen with them, especially, thinking about probably the age that both Peggy and Marion are maybe in their like early, like 23, 24, like they're getting to the age where they're going to be past, what is the common marrying age or the expectation for, elite classes. So I can understand why Agnes is like, we need to get this done. Whereas Oscar looks like he's pushing his 30s, maybe mid 30s, 40s, who knows, definitely older. And now he's kind of allowed to do it. And I think that also speaks to this interesting of seeing, especially Bertha with her children of different genders, like how much control can she actually exert over them? And it's clear that with Gladys, she has a little bit more control for a variety of reasons, including that women were just kind of, daughters are expected to fall under the umbrellas of their parents. And you really at that particular social strata were kind of just kept at home until you got married, and then you would go to your new home and have your new core family and have children and continue this cycle, which is partially why Marion going out and turning a hobby, which was totally acceptable, watercoloring, into a profession, even though it's a really well off school, very held in very high regard, but still the fact she's working is questionable at all, and why she would want to do that. And I'm hoping we'll get a little bit more into those storylines, because you are seeing at this time, thinking about the 1870s, that there is that growing call for women's rights to vote and the growing suffragette movement and women entering the workforce more and more at different levels as industrialism and capitalism kind of keep pushing society further and becoming a bigger part of the economy.
I wonder if they'll get more into that for Marion's character. It's obviously played a pretty big part in her, in her role this first so far this season. Speaking of working women, we can turn back to Peggy, which, Peggy winds up, we mentioned the scene with her father, which was really touching, but she has made this decision and been invited back to work in the Van Ryn household. She's going to go back to work as Agnes's assistant secretary. So we see her leaving Brooklyn, right, and heading back over into Manhattan, which her father is sad about. Clearly, he understands why she's going, it seems like, but he he regrets, and he's telling her again that he's sorry about everything that happened. And it was a kind scene. They seem to be, I don't know what you guys thought, like making a little bit of amends together, a little bit of repair there to that relationship as she heads out on her own. Thoughts about that, or her dad, or her winding back up with the Van Ryns? Is that a good move for her?
Yeah, I felt like the scene was extremely touching. A testament again to that father-daughter relationship. Also, meaning Arthur's concern about her moving away was very common. Obviously, during this time, young women were very vulnerable, being off on their own without a male figure or family member to kind of protect them. And as far as her moving back into the Van Ryns house, it's both good and bad. I think, as we saw with the interaction between her and Mrs. Armstrong, we know that Mrs. Armstrong is still not keen on Peggy. And there is that scene, of course, where Peggy talks to Agnes and basically says to her, I'm concerned about Miss Armstrong. And she essentially is asking for Agnes's protection, which Agnes agrees to. But we also later see that interaction between her and Mrs. Armstrong in the servants' dining room, where Mrs. Armstrong, even though Agnes has already gave her an ultimatum about like, hey, you better be nice to Peggy or you're out. She still is kind of testing the waters, essentially, with Peggy, even though Peggy has gone out of her way to be kind to her. And I appreciated that they actually allowed Peggy to stand her ground in this scene and just say, listen, I didn't come here to fight, but if you want to, essentially, I think she says, I have no quarrel with you. Really, I don't. But if you do, I can guarantee you don't want one with me. And I was just like, yes, stand up for yourself. Know that, you are really the only person who can actually protect yourself, in this environment. So
Armstrong doesn't behave herself for 24 hours, right? I mean, she has that talk with Agnes, and where Agnes pretty much tells her, like, if it's between you and Peggy, it's gonna be Peggy, which is a very interesting thing. But Armstrong doesn't heed that. I mean, she just right away kind of is at Peggy downstairs in the servants' quarters. And you're right, Alonna, because there's nobody else down there other than Peggy who's gonna. I mean, I think the other servants like her, and they have helped her, but Peggy has to speak up for herself, or she won't get anywhere. That scene between Mrs. Armstrong and Agnes was very interesting. We talk here at the Frick about domestic staff a lot. They were part of the life of the household because of documentation. You both know, we have photographs, we have receipts, we have payroll records. We know a fair amount about the people who worked here, at least names and what they made, and a little bit about them as people. And so we talk about Mrs. Frick having a lady's maid and work with what that role was. And it was interesting that Armstrong, is clearly terrified at the thought of losing her position. And she says, I'm older and nobody will hire me at this stage of the game. They want younger maids who they can train up in their own style. I always sort of understood or thought that a lady's maid who had experience in, fashion and caring for clothing, because part of her job would have been to care for, Agnes's finer things, her jewelry, hairstyling, just keeping her sort of ready for social events. I would think that skill over a lifetime would be translatable to another household, but she's very afraid that she's going to wind up on her own. And that was sad. And she's so much at the mercy of Agnes that feels terrible, honestly. Thoughts from either of you? Lauryn, I think you had some thoughts on this when we were talking about it earlier.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the reality that you could be replaceable, in the life of excess, that maybe, as we see with Bertha, who currently is training up the really young maid as she waits for, it's unclear if she's going to hire a new maid or if she's just going to continue training this particular maid, but that you can find other people. We are in a heavy period of immigration. People are coming to America to live out the American dream. And when I was doing a little bit of research, it seemed that at this time, especially with industrialization, you had native born women, so white women who were born in the US, starting to move into these more genteel jobs as secretaries, as that becomes a bigger market share, so to speak, of jobs available for women, and that immigrant women and their daughters who were born in America were starting to really become domestic household servants. And what was really interesting too in the research I was doing, because we had kind of touched on Peggy and her unusual position of she gets a bedroom upstairs, but she has to have her meals in the servant quarters. And it seems that it was, this is from Erica Armstrong Dunbar, who was a historical consultant. I believe she's a professor at Rutgers University. I was reading some interviews from her speaking about how this would be really atypical to have Peggy actually living in the home as a Black woman, and that for many white women, they did not house their Black servants because there was a belief that with an immigrant white woman, you could kind of train up and help them, aspire to a new level, but that wasn't possible for Black women, obviously because of the racism of the period and the beliefs held about Black people. Because, and I have to constantly remind myself, I'm not a Gilded Age specialist by training. I really do early modern, but, situating this is not a very long time after the Civil War. It feels like so long ago, but we're really only dealing with a couple of decades since that happened. So keeping that in mind when thinking about these relationships. But very interesting about Mrs. Armstrong. I am curious if she's going to say something and get herself fired, or how far will Agnes actually take it, or will she be able to continue to be enabled with some slaps on the wrist and some warnings if she continues to antagonize Peggy?
Anything to add, Alonna? Thoughts on that? Or
yes. One thing that really struck me with that whole scene between Agnes and Mrs. Armstrong was just that, yes, I totally understand her fear about being, kicked out and possibly not being rehired somewhere else. But what really got to me was like, she was so blinded by her own bigotry that she couldn't even see a possibility beyond that. She couldn't even accept that she could possibly be kind to Peggy and not antagonize or bother her in any way. It was just kind of like I think she felt that Agnes should have sympathized with her. And I just couldn't understand that. She literally had a choice to be kind, stay cool, and keep her job, or continue down this kind of, for lack of a better word, racist kind of path, and be dismissed from her job. Like, to me, the choice was really easy, and she just couldn't see past it.
And Agnes put it, she was upset about her treatment of Peggy, and it's in season 1, when Peggy leaves the house. So this is not the first conversation they've had about this. We'll see what happens. I do enjoy the sort of standoff conversation, like they're not even conversations, but standoff moments between Peggy and Armstrong. They're some of the sort of witty kind of tense moments, I guess. So we'll see if those continue. This whole episode was full of some really great like one-liners and things that I laughed out loud at. Maybe I shouldn't have, but they were funny, and just there was just a lot of snappy wit. And it was such a busy episode too, with all of the stuff happening at Newport and everything happening in the households. I felt like they crammed a lot in, as we were talking about. Another, it's small but interesting servant storyline was the Jack with the alarm clock. He's a footman, right, in the Van Ryn household, who keeps sleeping in, and his alarm clock isn't working, and he's very upset about it. But Alonna, you were talking a little bit about alarm clocks, some things that I didn't know. Again, looking at time and timeline, I thought everybody had them, but that wasn't the case, right? Or a lot of people did, but not until 20th century. Is that what you were saying when we talked before?
Yeah, actually, Lauryn and I both kind of brought up this point, but yeah, alarm clocks have really been around since the 1700s, but were hugely inaccurate, just didn't work very well at all until 1847. And I can't remember, do you remember what the name of the inventor or the person who fixed it was, Lauryn?
I believe it was French.
Yes.
But I can't off the top of my head.
Yes. And so there was this inventor who improved upon the alarm clock to where it, became sort of a wind up clock. But again, not everybody, like you said, Amanda, not everybody had alarm clocks during this time. And they relied on sort of older methods in order to get up. And one of the methods, in some cases, was somebody who was called a pea shooter. And they would literally shoot peas through a straw out a window to wake people up in the morning, and sometimes hit the people if the windows were open. You also might have somebody who walked around and announced that it was time to get up. And I think one of our questions when we talked about this was like, well, who got those people up? And that I don't know the answer to. Maybe a chicken or a rooster or something like that.
Very early risers who can.
Yeah. Or, even like with the tolling of a church bell to tell the hours, which is, more common occurrence in bigger cities and Europe, especially those older cities. But for a place like New York, if maybe you were living close enough to a church. But I thought it was really fascinating that it seemed like everyone in the servants' quarters had their own alarm clock, and it was a really fun exchange to hear them talk and be like, well, I wake up before my alarm. I believe it was like the German cook. Yeah. She's like, I don't need it. And I think it'll be really interesting to see Jack's story with this, if he ever gets his alarm clock fixed and, wakes up on time. But it does seem like we're starting to see some outward mobility, looking beyond being a domestic servant for his lifetime, which would have been the reality for so many people, just even, the generation before, the generation he's working with, those older head butlers, like Church. And I can't remember the other butler's name of the two dueling houses, who constantly critique one another. But that there might be a reality for him to make a somewhat livable wage outside of the house.
Yeah, he clearly, is trying to, he just is taking this on himself. He's taking this thing apart. He's going to sort of figure it out. And the other servants are scoffing at him for it, but he's like, no, I'm going to get this. On our Clayton tour and here, different things we do, talking about the Industrial Revolution and industry and sort of the changes that are coming into, obviously in England earlier and then the United States in the 19th century, this concept of time is driven in a lot of ways by industrialization. The idea that now people aren't, not as many people are working on farms or in rural environments where the seasons and the sun and the time of day kind of shaped your schedule. Now it's, clocking in, clocking out, showing up, obviously social engagement, showing up on time. It's just an interesting thing to think about, time being much more important in this New York Gilded Age world, or in the United States, in the late 19th century, because the things are changing and there's different obligations in different places that people have to be. So anyway, I enjoyed that with him. We'll see what happens with trying to get a girlfriend, fixing his clock. Like, he's just really, starting to do some things, and I loved it. We talked about Watson and his daughter. We'll see where that goes. They kind of left that one hanging still. Mr. What was the last name?
Neil, the husband. I think it was Neil.
Yeah, comes to see Watson, who we find out had a different name in his prior life. We were saying in our planning that, this won't get out. They're worried about this getting out, the McNeils. But if Watson doesn't want to tell anybody and the daughter doesn't want to tell anybody, nobody's really going to know. But actually, her husband showing up at the house and talking to Mr. Russell, even though he didn't reveal what was going on, they're starting to tease it out as, a potential problem. And if she is involved in the opera work with Bertha Russell and her father's a servant, Mrs. McNeil is going to be an interesting link between those two worlds, kind of things colliding going forward. So we'll see again where that takes us. We can't, unless I've missed anything on this list, we can't end this episode without talking about labor in Pittsburgh, which is what we live and love, work with all the time, what we live for here. Mr. Russell is determined to get involved, or he is saying that things in Pittsburgh are getting bad and it's time to take some action. So I don't know, Lana or Lauryn, if one of you want to recap what's going on and where we think this is headed, because they're clearly pulling from 1892 Homestead in Pittsburgh for this 1883 storyline.
Yeah, I'm very disappointed we didn't actually go to Pittsburgh, and it seems like we won't go to Pittsburgh, but that Pittsburgh is going to come to us. So all we really know is that Richard Clay, who is Mr. Russell's secretary, Richard Clay, which I have to believe is a nod to Frick with the Pittsburgh storyline. He gets sent down by Russell to try and win over the head of the union. I believe his name is Henderson. And he comes back. He's been unsuccessful. This, head of the union is very determined. And Mr. Russell decides, we're going to wine and dine him, bring him up, get him a suite in New York. He's going to have dinner at my lavish, palatial, brand spanking new house. And I don't know, Alonna or Amanda, if you remember this specific line, but another one of those quips where it's like, oh, he's an honorable man and that'll just make him more expensive. Was kind of the line thrown out by Mr. Russell, where he seems totally unfazed and that this will be a really easy battle to win.
Yeah. What was your take on that? Because I enjoyed what you said about how you think that's really going to go about him being expensive. What you were saying about when this union man comes to New York, what he's going to.
Definitely the wrong way to handle it. I think he's going to see this wealth because we know what the conditions were like in those steel mills and just how dehumanized the workforce was, while to see the actual lavish luxury that his and his coworkers' hard labor is producing for this one family, I think is just going to make him even more passionate about the cause. And just with the language that's been used in the two episodes, when you have these wealthy industrialists talking about the potential for strikes and the issues with workers and the fact, oh God, they want an 8-hour workday. I just think there's no way it's not going to end in a bloody battle like so many of them did when we talk about the Homestead 1892 strike that I believe is probably, I think many of us think this is where they're drawing their source material from by specifically mentioning Pittsburgh. But just I go back to the Jay Gould character last episode saying, I want to pay half the working class to murder the other working class because they're being such a nuisance to him. And really it's him, the fact that they're costing him money and time when he clearly doesn't need any more. When I want them to go to Pittsburgh because I want to see this storyline more fully fleshed out of what was the lived reality. But, this is also supposed to be like a delicious, sexy, fun, dramatic, gossipy show about a particular social strata. So I don't know how much we'll get into that, but I would love for someone to try to assassinate Mr. Russell so we could talk about Henry and the anarchists, which was another big part of this particular story.
I wonder if they'll take it there. That's a good point. I thought I read somewhere that there are some scenes of Pittsburgh, but they filmed them in New York. So we'll see
Makes
what
sense.
happens. I might have made that up. Sometimes I invent things. I might have
Oh,
invented that, but I think I read that somewhere. I don't know, Alonna, if you heard that too, or if you know anything else about, or have any guesses about where this storyline is going to go for us and for Pittsburgh.
I don't, but I do hope that they show us. I'll put that in quotes, show us a little bit. So again, like Lauryn said, we could see that the reality of what was happening at that time. But I want to go back, Lauryn, you had mentioned something really interesting when we were discussing this about a piece of art that was in the scene with Mr. Clay and Mr. Russell. You want to talk a little bit about that?
yeah. Yes. So I am an art historian by training, and I have to believe this inclusion was purposeful because we're in this kind of dark wooden study and there's only really light coming in from the window, and we'll try and do a screen grab because it's always good to have pictures for this part of the episode. But there's a Roman emperor marble bust sitting between Richard Clay and Mr. Russell as they're kind of making their big plan of attack with Henderson to bring him in and strategizing on how best to move forward. And I just have to believe that they are kind of pulling on this royal imagery, and a lot of the emperors were very brutal. That's how the Roman Empire got as big as it did. They were brilliant strategists who really took no prisoners in a lot of cases. And obviously it was a very long period, and I'm not a specialist in Roman imagery, so I can't say to which one they're pulling on, though it would be great if someone in the comments wants to do, a little digging and see if they can go down that rabbit hole and let us know if we think it's a particular ruler, because I just don't know off the top of my head, but I think there is definitely a pull of that imagery of him, Mr. Russell, as this powerful figure who's about to crush a rebellion.
I had not even noticed that detail, so I love that you did and that you brought that up. The references are important, and maybe this is where we wrap up, because Alonna and Lauryn, both of you had caught some names and things that, again, details they're pulling in, the writers. Sometimes it's in place of an actual real life person. Sometimes they are using the name of a real person or place. But you noticed a few of those in this episode as well, where the writers are really giving us some little Easter eggs and clues as to things that are happening. Alonna, you mentioned a few, right? I think you had a list.
Yeah. So obviously one of the big ones that kept coming up, and they literally said it like 5 times, which was really funny because there's one part where Marion actually looks right at the camera and says it. But the name Dick Sears. And at first I was like, okay, are they talking about like Sears and Roebuck and Co., the company? Because obviously this is really popular at this time. But no, Dick Sears was a real person. He was a tennis champion during this time. And yeah, so he's one of the real people that they introduced in this episode that is prominent during the Gilded Age. Another name that came up was Drexel, which we know Drexel University is in Philadelphia. I believe it was founded in 1890 or 1891 by a philanthropist. Again, very active during the Gilded Age. We already discussed Morgan and all the implications of that name. You have JP Morgan Chase. There were some other ones as well. And then the Wintertons. The Wintertons, while I didn't find any Gilded Age family that had that exact name, I'm thinking this is a play on the last name Winterthur, related to the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. And the Winterthur family is known, their patriarch was a horticulturalist. So I think that's the relation to that particular family. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that there's this scene where Ada and Reverend Forte are talking, and of course, that's a whole nother relationship that is potentially budding during this time. And Agnes, of course, she's always good for her one-liners and, kind of keeping everybody in check, says to Ada, goodness, I thought you were going to ask him for his mother's birth certificate. And that line really struck me because in my research doing genealogy and looking at records from the Gilded Age period, what I noticed was that birth certificates were not extremely common during this time. In fact, most states didn't start keeping records of birth until the early 1900s. The United States as a whole didn't require this until 1902. But the state of New York actually began enforcing that people had to have a birth certificate in 1880 and 1881, which perfectly aligns with the time period that we're in. So I thought that was really interesting that they threw that in there to get us kind of thinking about what the United States is looking like at this time, how we're starting to be very conscious about keeping statistics on health and tracking people, essentially.
And that has to do too with like immigration, right? I mean, there's just a whole lot of reasons why the governments are starting to pay attention, good and bad reasons for who's born where, right? That's interesting because 1880, 1881, if this is 1883, then that would have been a sort of state conversation that had just happened where that was written into law that birth certificates were required. Fascinating stuff. Love these little details, chances to learn a little bit more. Before we wrap up, is there anything either of you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, or comments about what's to come? Anything that we forgot to cover?
I think we could hit a lot of it. And as we've noticed, these 2 episodes, themes keep reappearing and getting larger. So I feel confident that we can talk about them next week if we get them this week. I did just want to say that in names mentioned, they also mentioned the Met with the Morgan. And when you brought that up, I don't think he's a real Morgan. I've tried to Google to see if an Edward Morgan exists and not from that period. But I did find it quite humorous that they decided to make him kind of this like art-hating drunk buffoon, given that, JP Morgan was a huge art collector. Henry Clay Frick buys art from his collection after he dies. And I think several pieces in our collection here at the Frick Pittsburgh, at the Frick Collection in New York, would have originated from the Morgan. So they were huge art philanthropists and very involved with the Met too. So I thought that was pretty, just like a funny little quip that they added in as they talk about the Met now being built, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. All the Mets are coming up. You have the Metropolitan Opera, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We'll see what appears next week.
All the Mets. Fun. Anything, Alonna? Final thoughts? Did we get all the points that we wanted to make in? Again, there was so much in this episode to cover.
Yeah, I think we hit the majority of it. I'm just really excited again to see what happens with Pittsburgh. And then also, again, Ada and Reverend Forte's relationship. I am excited to see what happens with that and how Agnes takes it, because it's going to be filled with drama if this goes forward.
It's going to be good. Ada deserves a life of her own.
Yes. It does. And I feel like we would be doing our audience a disservice if we didn't at least briefly touch on the fact that we have some major drama brewing in the very last minute of Ward Alistair's party of the episode, where Bertha comes face to face with her maid, which she did not realize or doesn't know yet. And I wonder if it'll come out that the maid had come on to her husband, Mr. Russell, and that was part of why she was expelled from their household last season. So to now see that she has been brought out into society, has married this older, wealthier man who is like very elderly. So I'm curious how much of their storyline we'll get, or if they just kind of kill him off quickly. Since he's really just set dressing. He's the instrument that gets her back into the situation. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out, as if Bertha didn't already have enough on her plate taking on Carrie Astor. Now she has a whole new issue exploding.
I loved how she said, we will say nothing until we go home, and then I decide what we will say.
Yes, again.
I still have plenty to say about this lady's maid turned society woman. So we'll definitely, thank you. I can't believe we forgot that. Thank you. That was a perfect note to wrap up on. There's always a dramatic cliffhanger at the end of the episode. Thank you to you both again for your time and your expertise. Thank you to our viewers. We had Gosh, so many views and lovely comments. We welcome them. We love doing this along with all of you. Two episodes down, many more to go. Thank you, everybody, for following along on the Gilded Age with us. We will soon be watching episode 3, and we'll be back next week to do this again. We'll see who's on screen with us. We might have some different people on, but Alonna and Lauryn, thank you. I have so enjoyed being on with you again, and thanks to our viewers. We'll see you again soon. Bye, everyone.